The thunderous boom echoed across the Potomac River like the voice of God himself. Smoke billowed from the cannon as Corinne Henderson stood frozen in her perfectly manicured yard, watching her world crumble one blast at a time. Her mouth hung open in shock as the Navy officers reloaded for another ceremonial round. Just 30 minutes earlier, she had strutted down to my dock with legal papers in hand, ready to seize my family home through HOA intimidation and fake regulations. She thought she held all the power. She thought wrong. As the second cannon fired, sending another thunderclap across the water, Corinne stumbled backward toward her house. The same house that now served as the perfect backdrop for my grandfather's military legacy. The same house she would be fleeing from within 2 weeks. But I am getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you how a small-town HOA president picked a fight with the wrong veteran family and learned that some battles you simply cannot win. 3 months after my grandfather passed away, I found myself standing on the weathered dock of his riverside property, holding the deed in my trembling hands. The house sat on a pristine bend of the Potomac River, its colonial stone foundation dating back nearly 2 centuries. Grandpa had lived here for 40 years, but I had never truly understood what this place meant until now. The property stretched along 200 feet of waterfront, with the old dock extending 30 feet into what I would later learn were federal waters. Ancient oak trees lined the shore, their branches creating a natural canopy over the house. Everything felt peaceful, untouched by the suburban sprawl that had consumed the surrounding area. I walked through the house slowly, running my fingers along the original wooden beams and stone fireplace. In his study, I discovered boxes of military photographs and documents. My grandfather had been a Navy commander, something he rarely talked about during family gatherings. The pictures showed him on various ships, always in uniform, always with that serious expression I remembered from childhood. That afternoon, while I was examining the dock structure, a woman approached from the neighboring property. She was tall and thin, with perfectly styled blonde hair and a smile that seemed too wide for her face. She wore a crisp white blazer and carried herself with the confidence of someone accustomed to getting her way. "You must be the new owner," she said, extending her hand. "I am Corinne Henderson, president of the Riverside Estates Homeowners Association. Welcome to our little community." I shook her hand, noticing how her eyes seemed to be calculating rather than welcoming. "Thank you. I am just getting familiar with the property my grandfather left me." "Oh, wonderful," she said, but her tone suggested otherwise. "I hope you understand that we have certain community standards here. Nothing too restrictive, of course, but we do like to maintain the character of our neighborhood." She gestured toward my dock with a frown. "That old structure might need some updating to meet our current safety guidelines. We have had some concerns about waterfront properties lately." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the river breeze. "What kind of concerns?" "Well, we would not want any environmental violations or safety hazards," she said carefully. "I will send you some information about our community regulations. I am sure we can work together to bring everything up to standard." After she left, I stood on the dock wondering what I had gotten myself into. The peace I had felt earlier was gone, replaced by a growing unease. That evening, I noticed fresh surveyor marks along my property line. Small orange flags that had not been there that morning. Someone had been measuring my land without permission. I called my grandfather's neighbor, an elderly man named Pete who had lived there for decades. "Pete, did my grandfather ever have problems with the HOA?" Pete was quiet for a moment. "Your grandfather was not technically part of their HOA, son. This property predates their development by about 100 years. but that Karen woman has been trying to expand their jurisdiction for years. She has been eyeing waterfront properties like yours for a long time. That night, I could not sleep. I kept thinking about Karen's calculating eyes and those mysterious surveyor marks. My grandfather had fought in 2 wars to protect American freedoms, and now some neighborhood busybody wanted to take away the home he had loved for 40 years. I had no idea that Corinne Henderson was about to make the biggest mistake of her life. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, printed on official-looking letterhead with bold red text. Urgent. Mandatory attendance required. The Riverside Estates HOA demanded my presence at an emergency meeting regarding critical waterfront property compliance violations and community safety concerns. The meeting was scheduled for Thursday evening at the community center, giving me less than 48 hours to prepare. The letter listed no specific violations, only vague references to environmental hazards and structural noncompliance issues. My stomach churned as I read the threatening tone. Thursday evening came faster than I wanted. I arrived at the community center to find the parking lot nearly empty, which struck me as odd for a supposedly urgent community meeting. Inside, about 15 people sat in folding chairs arranged in rows facing a small stage. Corinne stood behind a podium, wearing a navy blue suit that made her look like a prosecutor. I recognized none of the faces in the audience. These were not the neighbors I had met during my few visits to the property. These people looked like Corinne's personal army, all nodding and murmuring agreement before she had even started speaking. "Thank you all for attending this important meeting," Corinne began, her voice echoing through the microphone. "Tonight, we address a serious situation that threatens our community's safety and property values." She clicked a remote, and a PowerPoint presentation appeared on the wall screen. The first slide showed an aerial photograph of my property with red arrows pointing to my dock. This waterfront structure poses significant environmental and safety risks to our community. My blood pressure spiked as she continued. The dock extends into environmentally sensitive waters without proper permits. The aging structure could collapse at any time, creating debris that would damage neighboring properties and harm local wildlife. She clicked to the next slide, showing a chart with legal-sounding terminology about riparian rights and community maritime guidelines. None of it made sense, but it sounded official enough to intimidate someone who did not know better. Furthermore, Corinne continued, the property owner has refused to comply with our community's established waterfront standards. This forces us to take immediate action to protect our residents and our property values. I stood up, my hands shaking with anger. "Excuse me, but I was never informed of any specific violations. This is the first I am hearing about these supposed regulations." Corinne's smile was cold and patronizing. "Sir, ignorance of community standards is not an excuse for noncompliance. We have documentation showing that all waterfront property owners were notified of these requirements." She was lying, and we both knew it, but her audience of supporters nodded along as if she had presented irrefutable evidence. I realized this entire meeting was a setup, a carefully orchestrated ambush designed to make me look like the unreasonable one. "The community has voted," Corinne announced, "to give you 30 days to remove the dock structure and restrict all river access from your property. Failure to comply will result in daily fines of $500, plus legal action for costs and damages." My heart raced as the full scope of her plan became clear. She was not just trying to regulate my property. She was trying to destroy it. Without river access, the waterfront property would lose most of its value and appeal. She was essentially trying to steal my grandfather's legacy through bureaucratic intimidation. "This is ridiculous," I said, standing up again. "You have no authority over my property. I never agreed to join your HOA." Corinne's eyes gleamed with malicious satisfaction. "Actually, the county has recently expanded HOA jurisdiction to include all properties within our designated community boundaries. Your property is no longer exempt from our regulations." She clicked to a final slide showing what appeared to be county documentation. "You have 30 days to comply, or we will seek legal remedies including property liens and forced compliance through the courts." The meeting ended with Corinne's supporters filing out like a jury that had already reached its verdict. I sat alone in the empty community center, staring at the blank screen where Corinne's presentation had been. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the folding chairs. As I walked to my car, Corinne caught up with me in the parking lot. "I hope you understand that this is not personal," she said with fake sympathy. "Some people just need to learn their place in this community." That night I lay awake staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with anger and fear. Corinne Henderson had just declared war on my family. She had no idea what she was up against. I spent the next week consuming every piece of information I could find about property law, HOA regulations, and waterfront rights. My dining room table disappeared under stacks of legal documents, maritime charts, and printed internet articles. I had notebooks filled with case law references and contact information for property rights attorneys. The deeper I dug, the more I realized that Corinne's claims were built on shaky ground. HOA jurisdiction could not simply be expanded to include properties that had never been part of the original development. My grandfather's property had been established decades before the Riverside Estates subdivision even existed. But Corinne clearly had resources and connections that I lacked. She had managed to get official-looking documents and county support for her expansion plans. Fighting her through normal legal channels would cost thousands of dollars and take months or years to resolve. Late one night, while reviewing my grandfather's military records, I found something that made my heart race. Among his service documents was a commendation for his role in coordinating naval training exercises along the Potomac River. The citation mentioned his invaluable assistance in establishing training protocols for riverine operations in the Washington metropolitan area. I stared at the document, reading it again and again. My grandfather had not just served in the Navy. He had helped establish military training operations in the exact location where his property now sat. This was not just a coincidence. I called Pete the next morning. "Pete, did my grandfather ever mention anything about Navy training exercises on the river?" "Oh, absolutely," Pete said. "Back in the 70s and 80s, they used to run boat exercises right there by your dock. Your grandfather coordinated with them because he knew the river better than anyone. They would launch from his property sometimes." My pulse quickened. "Do you remember any details about these exercises?" "Well, they would practice different scenarios. Sometimes they would fire blanks from old cannons to simulate historical naval battles. Your grandfather loved those demonstrations. He said it connected modern sailors to their maritime heritage." I hung up the phone and immediately started researching federal maritime law. What I discovered changed everything. Properties that had been used for military training or maritime operations often retained special legal protections under federal law. More importantly, veterans and their families could petition for ceremonial naval support for educational and commemorative purposes. I found the contact information for the Naval Heritage Foundation and called their office in Washington. A friendly officer named Commander Williams listened to my story with growing interest. "So your grandfather coordinated training exercises at that location?" he asked. "Yes, sir. I have the documentation here. And this HOA is trying to restrict your access to the water. They want to force me to tear down the dock and eliminate all river access." Commander Williams was quiet for a moment. "You know, we have been looking for suitable locations to conduct public education programs about naval heritage. Your property sounds like it might be perfect for that kind of outreach." My heart pounded as he continued. "We occasionally conduct ceremonial demonstrations that recreate historical naval training exercises. If your property has that kind of military history, we might be able to arrange something." "What kind of demonstrations?" I asked, barely able to breathe. "Well, we have period-appropriate equipment, including historical cannons that we use for educational purposes. We fire blanks, of course, but the sound and smoke effects are quite impressive. It helps people understand what naval warfare was like in earlier periods." I could hardly believe what I was hearing. "And you could do this from my property?" "If the location is suitable and the federal waters are accessible, absolutely. We would need to file some paperwork, but veteran families often receive priority for these kinds of commemorative events." That afternoon, I submitted a formal application for a Naval Heritage educational demonstration. I included copies of my grandfather's service records, photographs of the property, and detailed maps showing the relationship between my dock and the federal waters. Within 2 weeks, I received a response that made my hands shake with excitement. The Naval Heritage Foundation approved my request for a ceremonial demonstration of historical naval training exercises, to be conducted on the exact date that Karen had threatened to begin legal proceedings against me. As I read the approval letter, I realized that Karen Henderson had made a critical error. She had picked a fight with someone who had access to resources she never imagined. She wanted to play games with official authority and legal intimidation. I was about to show her what real authority looked like. The next morning, I called Commander Williams to confirm the details of our Naval Heritage demonstration. His enthusiasm was infectious as he described the historical significance of our planned event. "Your grandfather's coordination with naval training exercises makes this particularly meaningful," he explained. "We can recreate some of the same ceremonial elements that would have been used during his era of service." "What exactly would that involve?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Well, we would bring a period-appropriate patrol boat to your dock. We have a beautifully restored vessel that we use for educational programs. We would also bring some of our ceremonial equipment, including a working replica of a Civil War-era naval cannon." My heart raced. "A working cannon?" "Oh yes, it fires blanks, of course, but the sound and visual effects are quite impressive. We use it to demonstrate how naval artillery worked during historical conflicts. The smoke effects and thunderous sound really help people understand the power of naval warfare." I could hardly contain my excitement. "And you can do this from my property?" "Absolutely. Your dock provides perfect access to the federal waters where we would conduct the demonstration. We typically invite the local community and media to observe these educational events. It helps build public understanding of naval heritage." Perfect. Karen would get front-row seats to her own defeat. Over the next week, I worked with Commander Williams to plan every detail of the demonstration. The Navy would arrive early in the morning with their patrol boat and ceremonial equipment. They would set up on my dock and in the federal waters adjacent to my property. The cannon demonstration would include multiple firings, recreating the kind of training exercises my grandfather had coordinated decades earlier. Each blank round would produce a thunderous boom and impressive smoke effects that would be visible and audible for miles along the river. Meanwhile, Karen escalated her harassment campaign. She posted flyers throughout the neighborhood claiming that I was endangering community safety and violating environmental regulations. She organized a petition demanding that the county force me to comply with her HOA demands. Her flyers were full of lies and exaggerations, but they looked official enough to fool residents who did not know the real facts. She claimed that my dock was structurally unsound and posed immediate dangers to water quality and wildlife habitat. I let her continue her campaign without responding. Every flyer she posted, every lie she spread, every threat she made was simply digging her hole deeper. She had no idea that her scheduled day of victory was about to become the most humiliating moment of her life. 2 days before the demonstration, I received a call from a local news reporter. "We heard about your Naval Heritage educational event," she said. "Would you be willing to do an interview about your grandfather's military service and the historical significance of your property?" I could hardly believe my luck. I would be honored to share his story. "Great. We would like to bring a camera crew to cover the naval demonstration. It sounds like a wonderful tribute to local veterans and maritime history." Karen was about to learn the difference between fake authority and real power, between neighborhood intimidation and federal jurisdiction, between HOA threats and military tradition. The night before the demonstration, I walked out to my grandfather's dock and stood looking across the river. Karen's house was visible on the opposite shore, its lights glowing through the trees. Tomorrow, she would watch from her yard as the United States Navy honored my grandfather's legacy and protected my property rights. I thought about my grandfather standing on this same dock 40 years ago, coordinating with naval officers to ensure successful training exercises. He had served his country with honor, and now his service was about to protect his family home from a petty neighborhood tyrant. Karen Henderson had spent months planning to seize my property through intimidation and fake legal authority. She had rallied her supporters, filed her paperwork, and prepared her legal threats. She thought she had covered every angle. But she had made one fatal error. She had assumed that I was just another victim who would roll over and accept her abuse. She had no idea that my grandfather's legacy included not just a beautiful riverside property, but also the kind of military connection that could bring the full ceremonial power of the United States Navy to bear on her schemes. Tomorrow morning, Karen would learn that some battles cannot be won through HOA politics and neighborhood intimidation. Some battles require real authority, real power, and real consequences. I smiled as I walked back to the house. Tomorrow was going to be a very educational day for Karen Henderson. Dawn broke clear and calm over the Potomac River. I had barely slept, but adrenaline kept me alert as I prepared for the most important day of my life. By 7 in the morning, I was standing on my dock, watching the river for the first signs of the Navy patrol boat. At exactly 8 o'clock, I heard the low rumble of diesel engines approaching from upriver. The patrol boat appeared around the bend, flying the American flag and the Naval Heritage banner. It was a magnificent vessel, about 40 feet long with a gleaming white hull and polished brass fittings. Commander Williams stood at the bow, wearing his dress uniform with ribbons and decorations that spoke of years of honorable service. Behind him, 4 other sailors worked to maneuver the boat toward my dock with military precision. "Good morning," Commander Williams called out as they approached. "Beautiful day for a heritage demonstration." "Thank you for making this possible," I replied, catching the rope they threw to secure the boat. "My grandfather would be so proud." As the sailors unloaded their equipment, I noticed Corinne's distinctive blonde hair moving around in her yard across the river. She was clearly watching the activity, probably wondering what was happening. Her HOA cronies had gathered in small groups along the riverbank, pointing and talking among themselves. The naval cannon was an impressive piece of equipment, a working replica of a Civil War-era naval gun mounted on a wheeled carriage. The sailors positioned it carefully on my dock, aiming it toward the open water where Corinne's house provided the perfect backdrop. "This cannon fires blank charges that produce authentic sound and smoke effects," Commander Williams explained to me. "Each round creates a thunderous boom that can be heard for miles. It really helps people understand the power of naval artillery." At 9:30, the local news crew arrived. The reporter interviewed me about my grandfather's service and the historical significance of the property. I spoke about his coordination with naval training exercises and his decades of commitment to preserving maritime heritage. "It means everything to me that the Navy continues to honor veterans like my grandfather," I said, looking directly into the camera. "This property represents not just family history, but American military tradition." As we spoke, I noticed more activity across the river. Corinne had gathered a larger group of supporters, and they were setting up what looked like cameras and legal documents. She was clearly planning to disrupt the demonstration with her HOA threats and seizure papers. At 10 o'clock, Commander Williams called for the crowd's attention. About 50 people had gathered to watch the demonstration, including neighbors, veterans, and local officials. The news crew positioned their cameras to capture the cannon firing with Corinne's house in the background. "Ladies and gentlemen," Commander Williams announced, "we are honored to conduct this educational demonstration of naval heritage, commemorating the service of Commander James Mitchell and his contributions to maritime training in this area." He nodded to the sailors operating the cannon. "Fire 1." The explosion was magnificent. The blank charge detonated with a thunderous boom that echoed across the water like the voice of God himself. Smoke billowed from the cannon barrel, creating a dramatic cloud that drifted across the river toward Corinne's house. The sound was so powerful that car alarms started going off in the neighborhood. Birds erupted from the trees along the shoreline. The very air seemed to vibrate with the authority of military tradition. I watched Corinne's face across the river as the smoke cleared. She had been approaching the water's edge with her legal papers, but now she stood frozen in shock. Her mouth hung open as she realized she was witnessing something far beyond her neighborhood authority. "Fire 2," Commander Williams called out. The second cannon blast was even more impressive than the first. The thunderous boom rolled across the water like a declaration of war. More smoke billowed toward Corinne's house, and I could see her stumbling backward in confusion and fear. Her supporters were scattering, clearly unprepared for the reality of what they were witnessing. They had come expecting to serve legal papers and intimidate a property owner. Instead, they were watching the United States Navy conduct an official ceremony honoring military heritage. The news cameras captured every moment. Corinne's attempted legal ambush was being broadcast live as she cowered in her yard, watching her authority evaporate in cannon smoke. "Fire 3," Commander Williams called out for the final round. The third blast was the most spectacular yet. The cannon recoiled with tremendous force, smoke and fire erupting from the barrel. The sound echoed off the hills and buildings for miles around. It was a sound that spoke of honor, tradition, and the kind of authority that could not be challenged by HOA politics. As the smoke cleared, I saw Corinne retreating toward her house, her legal papers scattered and forgotten. Her supporters had completely dispersed, leaving her alone in her yard to face the consequences of her actions. The demonstration continued for another hour, with the sailors explaining the historical significance of naval artillery and my grandfather's role in coordinating training exercises. But the real message had been delivered in those first 3 cannon blasts. Corinne Henderson had just learned that there are some battles you cannot win through intimidation and fake authority. Some battles require real power, real tradition, and real consequences. The war was over. I had won before she even realized we were fighting. Within an hour of the cannon demonstration, Corinne was on the phone with every authority figure she could think of. I watched from my dock as she paced frantically around her yard, her phone pressed to her ear, gesturing wildly at the river. Her first call was to the county sheriff. I could not hear the conversation, but I could see her growing frustration as she spoke. 20 minutes later, a sheriff's deputy arrived at her house and spent about 5 minutes explaining something that made Corinne's shoulders slump in defeat. Later that afternoon, Pete called me with the details. The deputy told Corinne that federal maritime exercises cannot be interfered with by local authorities, he said, chuckling. Apparently, she demanded that they arrest the Navy for disturbing the peace. Her second call was to the County Code Enforcement Office. Again, I watched her pace and gesture, clearly becoming more agitated as the conversation continued. An hour later, a code enforcement officer arrived and spent even less time explaining why Corinne's complaints were meaningless. The news coverage that evening was devastating for Corinne's reputation. The story portrayed the naval demonstration as a heartwarming tribute to local veterans and maritime heritage. My grandfather's service was highlighted, along with the historical significance of the property and the Navy's educational mission. Corinne appeared briefly in the background of several shots, looking like a villain trying to disrupt a patriotic ceremony. The reporter mentioned that some local residents initially questioned the demonstration, but made it clear that the Navy had full authority to conduct heritage education in federal waters. By the next morning, Corinne's HOA support was crumbling. I received calls from several neighbors apologizing for not speaking up earlier about her abuse of authority. They had been afraid to challenge her, but the naval demonstration had shown them that her power was built on intimidation rather than legitimate authority. "She has been making up rules for years," one neighbor told me. "We always suspected she was exceeding her authority, but no one wanted to be the target of her harassment." 3 days after the demonstration, I received an official letter from the Naval Heritage Foundation confirming my property's protected status under federal maritime heritage laws. The letter explained that properties with documented military history were eligible for ongoing protection and ceremonial support. Corinne's lawyer called her the same day with devastating news. After reviewing the federal jurisdictional issues and the negative publicity surrounding her campaign, he advised her to drop all legal action immediately. Fighting federal maritime jurisdiction would be expensive and futile. The HOA board meeting the following week was a disaster for Corinne. Half the board members resigned in embarrassment over her failed power grab. The remaining members faced angry homeowners demanding explanations for Corinne's unauthorized expansion attempts and legal threats. A motion of no confidence was introduced against Karen's leadership. The vote was not even close. 17 homeowners voted for her removal, while only 3 supported her remaining as president. But Karen was not finished. In a final desperate attempt to salvage her authority, she filed noise complaints against me with every local agency she could find. She claimed that the cannon demonstration violated noise ordinances and created a public nuisance. Her complaints were quickly dismissed when officials learned that military ceremonies are exempt from local noise ordinances. The cannon demonstration was a federally authorized educational event, conducted with proper permits and community notification. 2 weeks after the naval demonstration, Karen put her house up for sale. The for sale sign went up quietly, without any of the fanfare that usually accompanied her neighborhood activities. She had been effectively exiled from the community she had tried to control. The property seizure threats officially ended when Karen's lawyer sent a written withdrawal of all legal claims. The letter was brief and professional, but I could read the defeat between the lines. Karen Henderson's war against my family was over, and she had lost completely. That evening, I walked out to my grandfather's dock and stood looking across the river at Karen's house. The windows were dark, and a moving truck was parked in the driveway. She was leaving the community she had terrorized for years, driven out by the consequences of her own actions. I thought about my grandfather and how proud he would be to know that his service had protected his family home. The naval demonstration had not just defended my property rights. It had exposed Karen's abuse of authority and freed the entire community from her tyranny. Justice had been served, not through lawyers and lawsuits, but through honor, tradition, and the kind of authority that cannot be challenged by HOA politics. Karen Henderson had learned that some battles should never be fought the hard way. Karen's house sold within a month, well below market value. The new owners were a young military family who appreciated the property's proximity to the river and its peaceful setting. They had no interest in HOA politics or neighborhood power games. I established an annual Naval Heritage Day celebration at my property, with full support from the community and ongoing participation from the Naval Heritage Foundation. The event grew each year, attracting veterans, families, and history enthusiasts from across the region. The HOA underwent major reforms following Karen's departure. New bylaws were established that strictly limited presidential powers and required community approval for any expansion of jurisdiction. An oversight committee was created to prevent future abuses of authority. My relationship with the Naval Heritage Foundation continued to grow. My property became an official educational site where they conducted regular demonstrations and training programs. The dock was renovated with their assistance, creating a permanent platform for maritime education. Other homeowners who had suffered under Karen's harassment began coming forward with their own stories. She had targeted elderly residents, young families, and anyone she perceived as unable to fight back. Her removal had liberated the entire community from years of intimidation. The most satisfying moment came 6 months later, when I received a letter from the Department of Veterans Affairs recognizing my property as a protected historical site. My grandfather's service had been officially honored, and his riverside home was permanently protected from future seizure attempts. I transformed the property into a living memorial that honored both military service and property rights. A small plaque on the dock commemorated my grandfather's naval service and his coordination with training exercises. Visitors could read about his contributions to maritime education and community service. On quiet evenings, I would sit on the dock and watch the river flow peacefully past. The water carried away the stress and anger of Corinne's attacks, leaving only gratitude for my grandfather's legacy and pride in defending his final gift to our family. The community had learned valuable lessons about the dangers of unchecked authority and the importance of standing up to bullies. Corinne's departure had not just solved my immediate problem, it had made the entire neighborhood a better place to live. Sometimes late at night, I would hear the distant sound of boat engines on the river and think about my grandfather coordinating with naval officers decades earlier. He had served his country with honor, and his service had ultimately protected his family home from a petty tyrant who forgot that real authority comes from service, not intimidation. Corinne Henderson had tried to seize my river home through HOA politics and fake legal authority. Instead, she had awakened a sleeping giant and learned that some battles cannot be won through intimidation and harassment. My grandfather's legacy was secure. His riverside home would remain in our family, protected by the same military tradition that had guided his life of service. And every year, on Naval Heritage Day, the sound of ceremonial cannons would echo across the water, reminding everyone that honor and tradition will always triumph over petty tyranny. The river flows on, carrying with it the memory of justice served and lessons learned.